All right, folks, I'm ready to get started. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the end of the 10th week together. So today we're going to finish off Chapter 11, and then next week we're going to cover Chapter 12, and then that'll finish the second part of the course. So the second exam will be a week from Tuesday. So I hope you've kept that in mind and have allotted yourself the right amount of time to be able to prepare for it. Ideally, you've already been preparing for it by actually learning the stuff as we've been covering it these past few weeks, especially during the break. Hopefully, you spent some time to get caught up. Regardless of what the situation is, you do have some time. You have a couple of weekends. I know you have other stuff going on, but if you want to do well in this class, it does require a good amount of time to do well in it. So make sure that you're devoting the right amount of time to it. These next 13, 14 days or whatever it is. It's less than that. It's like 10. But there is time. So make sure that you are going to not leave this until the last moment. And just at least try to get caught up to the end of Chapter 11 this weekend. Really get the stuff down, understand it well. And then just, you'll have Chapter 12 left. You can read ahead if you want. Always a good idea. Also, I have lectures online from the previous year, which are available if you wanted to just get ahead on lectures too, whatever. You have the opportunity to take control of your learning in this class and really just get ahead of the schedule so that you can be as prepared as possible for the exam so you can do well in it. Obviously, there'll be a curve and all this silliness. And that will help people get by, but you shouldn't be about getting by. That should never be your goal. Your goal should always be to be the best, because you're not competing against your classmates. You're competing against yourself. Always. You're always trying to best yourself, get yourself further, so that once you're out there and you're going up against a lot of other people that are at that level already, you can be at that level as well, have a fighting chance in this world. That, as you know, it's very competitive. There's a lot of things that people want. There isn't a lot of that stuff to go around, and only the quote unquote best get it. Sometimes they get it in unfair ways, but there are fair ways of getting these things, and the fair ways of getting them involve you doing your absolute best in places like this. So do your absolute best in this place right now. 6 weeks till summer break. That means 6 weeks of whatever it takes to do well, and then you'll have 3 months to relax, decompress, reboot, just kind of filter out everything all the pain and whatever it is that you've gone through to get yourself through this semester. You'll get over it, but now is the time to really just put as much as you have into what you're doing. It's worth your time. It's worth your effort. It's worth the sacrifice. It is worth all of it. So make sure you're doing that. Make sure you're taking it seriously, making this a priority. And if you do that, things work out. Things work out as best they can. Life isn't perfect and never will be, but you can make it as good as it possibly can be by, again, just devoting yourself to the optimal level in everything that you do. All right, so we're going to finish Chapter 11, so I'll open up the homework for that. I'll make it due maybe on Monday. I'll make it due. Give me an extra day there. Beyond that, are there any questions about anything you'd like me to address before I move forward? All right, so remember there is a practice exam already online, so that's available for you. Lots of opportunities to get ahead. All right. So what's going on in this chapter? Well, again, the second part of the course is all about, kind of really coming to terms with this very important and specific approach that we take in economics to studying decision making, because ultimately the economy is based on decision making. There are individuals making decisions about what they're going to consume. There are individuals making decisions about what they're going to produce. But there's so many individuals that it becomes, this large force, which we call demand on the consumer side, and production, supply, on the supply side. To truly understand these things and ultimately how they interact and how they set prices and how goods are allocated in our markets, we really kind of have to get to the nitty-gritty of what those decisions mean. And so that's what this whole approach has been about, that we've introduced in this second part of the course, marginal analysis, figuring out how do we answer how much questions, how much to consume, how much to produce. So again, the first chapter we covered, chapter 9, was about just generally introducing you to this approach of marginal analysis, ultimately, which is the one that we focus on the most. And then in chapter 10, we looked at the consumption problem, like how do consumers choose what to consume, given that they only have so much money to consume, and the things that they consume have prices. The prices are meant to, ration the things that are limited in our society. So we have a whole framework for that. Ultimately, it involved marginal analysis. The extra utility, quote unquote, satisfaction that we get from additional units that we consume per dollar spent. We're trying to get the most out of that. When we choose to do something, we choose not to do something else. So when we are choosing to consume a certain amount of a good with our limited dollars, we are choosing not to consume other things. And so there was a marginal benefit to choosing to consume something to maximize your utility per dollar spent, which required you giving up something else that didn't give you as much marginal utility per dollar spent. And so the optimal point of consumption for a person was the point where the marginal utility per dollar spent was equal across everything they choose to consume. So that's the logic behind the equilibrium, the state of rest for that model, which again is meant to sort of provide us insights, provide us more in-depth understanding of how people choose to consume, which then becomes a very powerful tool in business to analyze consumption decisions, in economics to understand how the consumption sector is operating, so that we can account for how people are behaving in markets for goods and services, while we're trying to, maybe predict the prices of assets of all sorts, which is ultimately a lot of what this is about, like trying to kind of predict the future. And so in order to do that, you need to account for as much activity as possible in the system that you're interested in studying. And so all of this stuff has a lot of relevance. It's a very specific type of approach to understanding things, and you need to understand it in the particular way that we present it to you. So that's why it takes time for you to learn it. It's not intuitive. It's not something you can just come up with on your own. You need to spend the time to understand it. So make sure you do have done that for chapter 10. Chapter 11 is about jump into the other side of the market to analyze the decisions that producers make. Why do producers decide to produce a certain amount? Why do they decide to price at a certain level, given different market conditions? Well, we study all of that beyond this chapter, but this chapter provides us part of the framework we need to be able to answer those questions by establishing a model of just like the basic nature of production, which then allows us to understand the costs that firms consider. Costs that firms consider aren't straightforward. There's different costs that need to be taken into account. And so that's what this chapter is about. It's about establishing the basic logic that leads us to understand what all those costs are. So once we have that cost framework in place, we can compare it to the benefits of selling, which is, the extra money they can gain from selling additional units. And then that'll provide us what we need to be able to study the marginal cost versus the marginal benefit. That'll get us to the point of optimal supply for a producer. But producers operate in different markets. Some of them are very competitive. Some of them are not. And so we need to take that framework then and apply it to each market setting to understand how decisions are made in each of those market settings. And so that's, again, how all of this is going to be relevant and where it's taking us. Like, it's going to be connected, and it will take us very close to the end of the course. So it's important for you to really try to, get this now so that you're not trying to catch up later while you're learning new stuff that depends on your understanding of this stuff. So just make sure that you just really understand the nature of all the costs and stuff that we're going to talk about, or we've been talking about in this chapter. And then the next chapter is going to be the first application of this stuff, where we consider firms making decisions in the most competitive markets that could exist. So we consider a spectrum of competition. Either markets are going to be as competitive as possible, or they're going to be the least competitive possible, a monopoly. And there's going to be some cases in between, which wind up being the most common cases, but those wind up being more complicated. And so we'll start next week looking at the most competitive case. We'll take our costs, we'll use them there to figure out how firms make decisions in the most competitive markets. Then that'll end the second part of the course. We'll take the exam. After that, we'll study the other side of the competitive spectrum, monopoly. Then we'll start looking at the in-between cases. And then at the end, we'll cover a couple of other chapters that help us understand some other related issues that are important for this course. So last time we studied, we established the basic model of production, and that got us to the important concepts of marginal cost and average cost. I'll review those today. And then finally today we'll talk about the short run versus the long run. Again, the short run is defined as a time period in which at least one input into production is fixed. One thing that people need to produce, they cannot change that amount. And if they cannot change the amount, then that defines them being in the short run. As soon as they can change the amount of everything that they used to produce, then they are in the long run. And we'll talk about the implications of the long run for costs. All right, so last time we started off by introducing the production function, the relationship between the quantity of inputs that a firm uses to produce a quantity of output. Now, again, the inputs that they use can either be freely changed, and therefore it would be a variable input, an input whose quantity the firm can vary at any time, or it's an input that they cannot vary, which is called the fixed input, an input whose quantity is fixed for a period of time and cannot be varied. So for the example we were looking at, it was like the amount of farmland that could be used to farm wheat and and produce wheat. And so because they were limited by the amount of farmland they had, their fixed input, the only way they could increase the amount of wheat they produce, their output, is by increasing their variable input, hiring more people, their labor. It's the one input they can adjust in order to produce more if that's what they wanted to do. So the time period in which any producer is locked into a certain amount of an input, generally we consider that input to be like the capital. Capital is, again, the human-made things that we use to produce. So like the factory generally might be considered capital, and generally people that are producing anything will have a factory, but that factory will lock them into a certain amount of space, right? So it's the same thing as like the farmland for George and Martha. So anytime a firm is locked into some input, generally it's going to be considered capital. They will be in the short run, and as soon as the firms are able to adjust all their inputs, so George and Martha are able to get a larger farm. Any company that uses a factory to produce is able to increase the amount of factory space that they use. When that happens, when they're able to do that, they are in, by definition, the long run, because now they can adjust both the variable input, which was labor, and now the fixed input, which is now variable as well, which is capital. So in the long run, all inputs are variable, so therefore there are no fixed inputs. All right, so we looked at the production function in the short run, which is called the total product curve. It is the amount of output as a function of the amount of the variable input given a fixed amount of the fixed input. So this was a fixed amount of farmland, and this is the amount that George and Martha could produce of wheat if they hire more and more people. The extra amount of production that they can produce by employing extra people is called the marginal product of labor, the additional quantity of output from using one more unit of labor. So again, we looked at this table here that showed us at any given level of labor, you can produce a total amount of output. And the extra amount of output that you get from hiring additional people is your marginal product of labor. So going from 2 laborers to 3 laborers, the bushels of wheat increased from 36 to 51. So the marginal product of the third laborer hired was 15 units. Now, marginal product is not specific to just labor. It's general to any kind of input. So there's a marginal product of capital. There's a marginal product of any other type of input that's used, depending on which one is variable or not. But generally, we assume that labor is variable in this class. All right, so marginal product of labor can be calculated as the change in quantity over the change in labor. So if you don't have specific values that tell you how much output changes with additional units of labor, like you have in this table here, and maybe you have some data on like how much your output increases when you add 10 additional people, then you can still figure out the marginal product of labor by taking the difference between the quantities, dividing that by the difference in the amount of labor, which is 10 units. In this case, it was 285. So it started with 230 units of output. It went to 285 as a result of hiring 10 people. So that's 55 over 10. And you can simplify that to 5.5 units. So that tells you that each additional person hired over this range produced 5.5 extra units of output of wheat. That was their marginal product of labor. Now, generally, because there is a fixed input, we assume that there's going to be diminishing returns to an input, meaning that the marginal product will be decreasing as more people are hired as long as there's a fixed input. And that is because they are going to be limited by the amount of that fixed input. So like we're talking about farmland, let's say we're talking about a factory. And there's a factory that produces, let's say, cars, and they're enjoying a lot of sales, so they're hiring more people, but there's only so much factory space. So they hire more and more people, and they can produce more, but there's not enough room to get around eventually. Like there aren't enough machines for the efficiency of the factory to be improving. It's actually worsening. And so therefore the marginal product of labor, the extra output that you can get from hiring additional people, will be positive, but it will start to diminish. So this curve here plots the marginal product of labor, and we see it's decreasing. And how that shows up in our total product curve is that the total product curve is kind of flattening out. So at any given point, if you take the rise over the run, the rise being the change in wheat, the run being the change in labor, that is your marginal product of labor. So the slope of this curve at any given point is the marginal product of labor. And here it's just plotted as numbers. So you see it's decreasing, and here it shows up as just flattening out the total product curve. So we assume that to be the general characteristic of most production processes when there is a fixed input. There will be diminishing marginal returns to labor. All right, now we can talk about costs. So we did talk about costs. So because there's a fixed input, there will be a fixed cost to that input. And that fixed cost obviously will not change in the short run as long as the firm is not able to adjust that input. Generally, we think of it as capital again. So like if they can't adjust the farmland, if they can't adjust their factory space, they've paid a certain amount for it, and that is their fixed cost. And of course, they have a variable input, so they will have a variable cost. And if we're talking about labor being the variable input, then the variable cost is the cost of wages that you have to pay additional employees. Total cost of production, therefore, is going to be the sum of the cost of the fixed input plus the variable input. So total cost is equal to fixed cost plus variable cost. We can plot a total cost curve like we see here. So this table here tells us again, like the variable cost and the fixed cost at varying levels of our output that correspond to varying levels of our labor input. And we can see our fixed cost is not changing. We can see our variable cost is increasing as the firm wants to produce more. And so total cost is increasing. And because there is diminishing returns to labor, each additional person hired is producing less than the last person, then that means that total cost is going to be increasing as the firm produces more, because it takes more person hours to produce additional units, because again, as more people are hired, they become less efficient than the last one because there's not enough capital to go around. All right, so the two key concepts that are important as far as costs go are marginal cost and average cost. So marginal cost is the additional cost of producing an additional unit. It's the change in total cost with respect to a change in the quantity of output. If we look at this table here, here's the total cost of producing 1 unit. There's 108 fixed costs. There's a $12 variable cost. So the total cost is the sum of the two, which is 120. To produce another unit, this was a new example that we tracked. It was the Selena salsa example. Selena creates gourmet salsas. Her second salsa batch, her fixed cost didn't change, but her variable cost did increase. She had to employ more folks to produce more salsa. So her total cost, the sum of fixed cost plus variable cost, was 156. The extra cost of producing that second bottle of salsa, the marginal cost, was the difference between the total cost of producing 1 case and the cost of producing 2 cases, which is, in this case, 36. So the marginal cost of the second case of salsas was $36. So this table here, this column here in this table tells us the marginal cost of each additional unit that's produced. Here, going from the 6th to the 7th case, the marginal cost of producing the 7th case is $156. Now, marginal cost, again, increases due to diminishing returns to labor. So that means that our total cost curve is increasing at an increasing rate. So much like the production function was getting flatter as you move from left to right, as you move from left to right here, the total cost curve starts to get steeper because marginal cost is increasing. Each additional unit costs more than the last unit to produce because of diminishing returns to our variable input, our labor. So this is just plotting the marginal cost from this table here, and we see that it's positive, meaning that marginal cost does increase as more units are produced due to diminishing returns to labor. Yeah. Yeah. This one? Yeah. Yeah. No, the change is the difference between. So therefore, if you're going from 3 to 4, you're subtracting 3 from 4 to get 1. Yeah. And the change in total cost is 300 minus 216, which is 84, right? So, yeah. Don't worry, we'll do a problem right now to calculate all this stuff so it's clear. All right, so marginal cost is really important because, again, when we're doing marginal analysis, we need to compare marginal cost to marginal benefit. So when we're looking at, like, how much is a firm willing to supply in any given market setting, they're going to look at the marginal cost of production versus the marginal benefit, the extra benefit they gain from selling additional units, which is the extra amount of money they can earn from selling additional units. So marginal cost is important to set that quantity, how much they're going to sell in a market. Then once they do that, they need to figure out, okay, well, on average, how much does it cost me to produce at that level? And then that'll give them an idea of how much profits they're making. And so the other important cost we need to consider is the average total cost. So average total cost is just total cost divided by quantity. And you can figure out average total cost, again, by dividing total cost by quantity, or you can get back to total cost by multiplying your average total cost times the quantity. Now, much like total costs are made up of 2 different types of costs in the short run because there's a variable and a fixed input, then therefore our average total cost can be broken down into its individual components, which is the average fixed cost and the average variable cost of producing. So the average fixed cost is the fixed cost of production divided by the quantity of output at any given level. And the average variable cost is the variable cost of production divided by the quantity at any given level. Average total cost is equal to average fixed cost plus average variable cost. And so you can use these relationships to either go from averages to totals or back, depending on the kind of information you have. So let's do a problem here, calculating costs. That'll kind of solidify our understanding of the relationship between all these costs. So we're going to find the missing values in the table for this firm in the short run. All right, so we've got 100 units being produced, then 200 units being produced. There's the fixed cost We've got an average total cost, and we've got for 100 units, and we've got an average total cost for 200 units. With that information, we are able to fill out the entire table. All right, so we can figure out total cost. How can we figure that out? Let's figure out total cost of producing 100 units. How can we get that? We have fixed costs, but we don't have variable costs. So how else can we get total cost? Say that one more time. That is not correct. Quantity times what? Times the average total cost of production, right? Quantity times our average cost of production will get us to our total cost of production, right? So, yeah, so you got 300 times 100 there. That's going to get us our total cost. Can we do something else there? We can subtract fixed costs, right, to get variable costs, right? Let's figure out the total cost here as well. We've got 200 times 200. It's going to get us 40,000 there. So that's the total cost of producing 200 units. All right. Then you mentioned variable costs. Yes, we can figure out variable costs by subtracting fixed costs from total costs. So that's 30,000 minus 23,000, which is 7,000. So that gets us that. What's this number here? 23,000, right? Fixed cost is not changing. This firm is in the short run. So that's fixed cost can be filled in. That means we can figure out our variable costs for 200 units as well. So 40,000 minus 23,000 is 17,000. Can we figure this other stuff out now? How can we figure out this? Divide what by what? 23,000 by 100. I heard it, yeah. Speak up, folks. Don't be shy. I'm not going to bite you. All right, so fixed cost, 23,000 divided by 100. That's going to get our average fixed cost, $230. And we can do the same thing down here. There's our fixed cost, 23,000 divided by 200. That's equal to 115. How can we get this? We can subtract our 230 from 300. Or we can divide our variable cost by 100, right? We can get it both ways. So let's get this one the first way, which is variable cost divided by quantity. So 7,000 divided by 100, that's going to get us $70 there. And then over here, let's do it the other way. 200 minus 115 is going to get us to our variable cost once again, average variable cost again, which is $85. How are we going to get the marginal cost? What is marginal cost? Right, change in total cost over change in quantity. So what's the change in total cost? It's 10,000, not average total cost, remember. So what is the change in quantity? It's 100, right? So that's how we figure out the marginal cost. The change in total cost over the change in quantity. So 40,000 minus 30,000 over 200 minus 100, which is 10,000 over 100, which you can simplify down to 100. Yeah. Not the slope between 2 points, so the slope at a point. Yeah. But this gives us like sort of an average of those over the range of 200. So usually the marginal cost will be the value of one additional unit. Like how much does one additional unit cost? So here we're just kind of getting the average of all the slopes of this relationship that we don't really know because it's not given to us here. So like when we looked at the total cost curve at any given point, the slope was the marginal cost. Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, because remember, it's just the change in quantity, the change in total cost attributable to one unit change in quantity. So that's why ultimately we have to simplify this down to 100. All right, so make sure you understand how all this is done. If you want to, you make sure you do the math yourself. Obviously, I clicked a lot, but you should do it because some of you may be rusty on doing simple math. And there's nothing wrong with admitting that to yourself. It just requires that you do more math. So if you're kind of slow on doing math, you do more math and you get faster at it. That's how it works. You don't just sit there and just feel bad that you're not good at math. You have to do something about it. All of you can improve if you're bad at it, which I'm going to assume some of you are good at it. So, and ultimately, all of you have the potential to be good at it. So that should never be a barrier to you doing math. You should never stop yourself from doing math, which is what a lot of people ultimately do because they believe they can't. And you can. All of you can. Anyone can. It's very mechanical. We're very mechanical beings. We can handle anything mechanical. All right. So that's our marginal cost, 100. All right. So economists believe that the average total cost curve are going to have this U shape. And that's generally going to be the case with most firms, meaning that over a range, they will experience the average cost of producing to decrease, and then eventually they will see the average cost of producing will increase, given a certain amount of the fixed input. So this average total cost curve, again, because it's an average total cost curve, represents a short run situation in which one input into production is fixed. Yeah. Not the life of a business. It's just kind of like the range over which a business can operate, like depending on how big they want to get. Like so if they want to be kind of small over here, and they want to get a little bigger, then they'll realize that their average cost of producing will go down. But if they want to get really big, they'll have to just accept the fact that the average cost of producing will increase. And the only way they can change that is by changing their fixed input, which we'll talk about when we get to the short run versus the long run section. Yeah. All right. So given the fact that there's a fixed input, given the fact that there's diminishing returns to labor, and the fact that there is both a fixed cost and a variable cost that is going to be translated into averages and then affecting our average total cost, this is the relationship we're generally going to see for total cost. We're going to see them decrease initially and then increase initially, which means that there's an increase eventually, which means that there's some amount that can be produced that's going to minimize the cost of producing on average. There's some amount that will minimize that for every firm. Now, the average total cost curve has a U shape because average fixed cost and average variable cost move in opposite direction as output rises. So let's look at how that works. So remember, total cost is not changing in the short run. And so you have a number that's not changing divided by a quantity that is changing if the firm wants to get bigger and they want to produce more. So that means that the average total cost of producing as the firm produces more will be decreasing. I'm sorry, where does the average? Oh, here it is. The average fixed cost will be decreasing. We call that the spreading effect. So the larger the output, the greater the quantity of output over which the fixed cost is spread, leading to lower average fixed cost. So as the firm gets bigger in the short run, there is one amount of cost that's acting on their overall average cost of producing that is always pulling down their cost. As the firm gets bigger, the average cost of producing attributable to their fixed input will always be going down in the short run, as long as they're not changing their fixed input. But that's not the whole story with respect to the average cost of producing. Average cost of producing is made up of average fixed cost plus average variable cost. Average variable cost will be increasing when diminishing returns set in, and therefore there will be a diminishing returns effect. The larger the output, the greater the amount of variable input required to produce additional units, which leads to higher average variable cost. So here's our average variable cost. We see that at 1 unit of salsa cases being produced, the average variable cost is just $12. 2 units, $24. So for 2 units, the average total cost of producing 2 units is $78. We see that the average cost of producing that second unit, those 2 units, has a component to it which is attributable to how much workers have to be paid to create those 2 units of salsa, which is $24, which is more than how much wages had to be paid to produce 1 unit. So on average, for each additional unit, $24 worth of wages had to be paid to produce 2 units. To produce 3 units, the amount that needed to be paid in wages to produce 3 units was $36 per case being produced. So every time the firm wanted to increase the amount of salsa cases that they're producing, they had to pay more and more in terms of like how much time is being spent by workers to produce them, because there are diminishing returns to the input. So the average variable cost, due to the diminishing returns effect, is always going to be increasing as the firm tries to get bigger in the short run. So they have two forces acting on their average total cost. One is the average fixed cost, which is spreading. So the spreading effect of it is bringing down the average total cost. And then there's the other one, the average variable cost, which is going up, which is always trying to pull up the average total cost. So initially, when the firm is small and it's only producing a small amount of units, the spreading effect from the average fixed cost is dominant. So it is the one that is kind of driving the direction of the average total cost. So we see that initially, the average total cost is going to decrease. It goes from 120 to 78 to 72. Then it goes up to 75. Then it starts to increase. At the point that it starts to increase, that's the point at which the diminishing returns effect becomes the dominant force on the average cost of producing. So we see that going from the first to the second case, the average fixed cost went down from 108 to 54. So that was cut down by half, right? Then it goes down from 54 to 36. It went down by maybe a third there. Then it went down from 36 to 27. That went down by about a quarter there. So we see the spreading effect is going to continue, but it gets really small. Like from the 9th to the 10th case, the average fixed cost goes from 12 to 10.80. So that's a reduction of $1.80. But we see that over here, the average variable cost increases from 108 for 9 cases to 120. So that's an increase of $11, which is far bigger than this decrease in $1.80 from the spreading effect of the average fixed cost. So at this point where the average total cost starts to increase, that's the point in which the diminishing returns becomes dominant and starts to drive up average total cost. Before that, the spreading effect is dominant, which is bringing down average total cost. And so that's why firms in general will have a U-shaped average total cost curve. Initially, the average total cost of producing will be brought down by the spreading effect, but diminishing returns will eventually dominate and get average total cost to increase until the firm decides, well, now we are spending way too much on average to produce. We should maybe invest more in capital and get into a different short-run situation, which will get them into a different U-shaped average total cost curve, which we'll look at in a second. So again, at low levels of output, the spreading effect is very powerful because even small increases in output cause large reductions in average fixed costs, as we saw there. At low levels of output, the spreading effect dominates the diminishing return effect and causes the average total cost curve to slope downward. But of course, that then changes once the firm gets to its minimum cost output. And that's at the point where the spreading effect becomes dominant and starts to bring up the average total cost. So at the bottom of the U-shaped average total cost curve at point M, the two effects exactly balance each other out. So that's just the point where it's like they're exactly at balance. Neither one is dominant, and the firm is minimizing the cost of producing as much as it possibly can. And then beyond that, diminishing returns due to the average variable cost, due to diminishing returns to labor, will cause the average total cost to increase for the firm. All right, so this figure brings together basically curves for all the different costs we've been considering that are relevant to making individual decision-making by firms. There's marginal cost, there's average total cost, U-shaped. Here's our average fixed cost, which is decreasing from left to right, again, because of the spreading effect. And here's our average variable cost that's increasing due to diminishing returns. All right, so the minimum average total cost, so that point at which the average total cost is minimized is the point at which marginal cost is equal to the average total cost. So before that point, when the average total cost is decreasing, we see marginal cost is below it. And so average total cost is just an average, just like your grade point average, right? You have a certain amount of grade points at any given time, and that gives you a grade average based on the amount of classes you took. And if you take a class and let's say you get a lower grade than your average, it's going to bring your average down. So it just works the same here. Here's the average cost of producing. Here's the cost of producing additional units. If the cost of producing additional units is less than your average, then it's going to bring down your average. There's going to be a point where they're going to be equal. But beyond that, if the additional cost of producing additional units, the marginal cost, is greater than the average total cost, then that will start bringing up your average total cost of producing. So at the point where your average total cost starts to increase, which again is due to the fact that the diminishing returns becomes the dominant force on the average cost of producing, then that's the point where marginal cost starts to exceed the average total cost of production. At output less than the minimum cost output, marginal cost is less than average total cost, and average total cost is falling, as I said. At output greater than the minimum cost output, marginal cost is greater than average total cost, and average total cost will be rising. All right. So if marginal cost is less than average total cost, producing that extra unit lowers the average total cost. So again, just focusing on that relationship one last time, just to kind of solidify your understanding of it. Here's an extra unit being produced. It costs less to produce it than our average, so it brings down the average. But if marginal cost is greater, then producing this extra unit costs more than it does on average to produce this amount, which is going to bring our average up. And when marginal cost exactly equals average total cost, we must be at the bottom of the U, because only at that point is average total cost neither falling nor rising. I know this is redundant, and it needs to be, because the relationship between these costs winds up being really important to all the decisions that we're going to examine by firms later on. And we're going to be always looking at this framework. So now I'm going to show you the version of these cost curves that I need you to know. All right, so up till now, we've assumed that there are always diminishing returns to a labor input. And in reality, that's not necessarily the case. So if you imagine, like, any company, they haven't hired anyone. They've just paid for their fixed costs. They hire one person. That one person has to do everything. They have to produce everything. They have to maintain the machines. They have to answer the phones. They have to maintain the facilities, etc. You hire another person. They divide up the tasks. So they divide up the tasks and they start to get good at the things that they do. But it's still like there's only two people and there's a lot to do. So you hire a third person, you hire a fourth person. So for the first few people that are hired, the division of labor, the division of the tasks that results in specialization, in which people get better at doing their individual jobs, actually increases the efficiency of a production process, which means that initially the marginal product of labor will actually be increasing, which means that the marginal cost will initially be decreasing. So in practice, economists believe that marginal cost curves often slope downwards first as a firm increases its production from zero up to some level, and then slopes upward only at high levels of production. So at the point where marginal cost starts to increase, that's the point where there are diminishing returns to labor. So again, first person hired, they're doing everything. Second person hired, they start dividing up the tasks. Third, fourth, they're dividing up tasks. They're getting better at what they're doing. The company's doing well. They're selling a lot. They want to sell more, so they hire more people. Eventually, though, the fact that they only have so much factory space, so much farmland, the fact that they have a fixed input into production, the fact that their capital is fixed, causes their variable input to start having diminishing returns. So diminishing returns is still there. It's just we assume that initially there are increasing returns, which causes our marginal cost to decrease first and then increase. So our marginal cost curve, the one you need to be familiar with, is going to have this swoosh shape. It's going to look kind of like the Nike swoosh. It's going to go down and then it's going to go up. It's going to go down initially, but then it's going to start increasing. Before now, we were just considering the case where we looked at marginal costs increasing the whole time. But this is just a little bit more realistic perspective on it. So specialization initially leads to increasing returns to the hiring of additional workers and results in marginal costs that initially slope downwards. Once there are enough workers to have completely exhausted the benefits of specialization, diminishing returns to labor will set in. So typical marginal cost curves actually have the swoosh shape shown by this MC curve. All right, so for the same reason, the average variable cost curve are typically U-shaped as well, rather than the strictly upward sloping average variable cost curve that we looked at earlier. So much like the average total cost curve is U-shaped for the reasons we talked about earlier, the diminishing returns that tries to pull it up, and the spreading effect of the fixed cost that tries to bring it down, the average total cost is still U-shaped, and the point at which that change happens, where it goes from decreasing to increasing average total cost, is the point that marginal cost crosses it. Now remember, average total cost equals average fixed cost plus average variable cost. So at any given level of output, there's going to be an average total cost, and there will be an average variable cost. So the difference between these two curves is the average total cost, is the average fixed cost of producing. And because of this, the spreading effect, where average fixed cost is getting smaller as the firm increases the quantity they produce, then we see the difference between our average total cost and our average variable cost is also decreasing as we move from left to right. That's why the distance between these two curves gets smaller. So because initially now we are being a little bit more realistic and acknowledging that initially when the first few people are hired, there are increasing returns due to specialization, then again, that is leading our marginal cost to decrease. But it also means that our average variable cost, the average cost of producing that is attributable to the wages that we have to pay people to work, that will also initially be decreasing, because again, you're hiring people, the first few, and they're getting better at producing overall, which means that the average amount that people need to spend on producing will go down initially because they're getting better, they're specializing, dividing up the tasks. So that means the average amount that needs to be paid in wages to produce each unit is going to go down as well initially. And that will continue to happen even after diminishing returns start to increase our marginal cost, because again, this is an average, and as long as the extra cost of producing additional units is less than the average, it's going to bring it down. So that's why even after diminishing returns set in and marginal cost starts to increase, the average variable cost will continue to decrease up until the point where marginal cost crosses it. And again, that is the point where average variable cost will start to increase. So average variable cost will be U-shaped as well. It will be below the average total cost curve, and its minimum will be to the left of the average total cost curve. Why? Because even after marginal cost crosses average variable cost and starts to increase our average variable cost, there's still a spreading effect from the average fixed cost that is acting on our average total cost curve, and it is dominating up until this point. Even though average variable cost starts to increase, trying to bring up our average total cost, our average fixed cost, the spreading effect from that is still dominant and bringing down average total cost until marginal cost crosses it and starts to pull it up, which then brings up average total cost. So this relationship between the curves is important. What I just talked about, like the reasoning for it, is important. It helps you to understand like why these curves look the way they do. And again, they represent numbers. They represent actual important information that firms use to make their decisions in order to operate the best they possibly can. So it's important for you to like try to get in tune with this whole story that I just told about these curves to really understand these relationships and ultimately gain the kind of business intuition that you're expected to gain from this course. So the key features we saw from the example of Selena's gourmet salsas remain true. The average total cost curve is U-shaped, and the marginal cost curve passes through the point of minimum average total cost. All right, now let's talk about short run versus the long run. So in our original example, we assumed that Selena's gourmet salsas had a fixed cost of $108. This is the average total cost curve associated with that amount of capital. We compare that situation to one in which the firm buys additional food preparation equipment. So the food preparation equipment is their capital. It represents their fixed cost. They bought a certain amount. That's what they were using to produce more. They hired more people. But they realized as they were getting bigger that their average cost of producing was going up. So they said, okay, we need to buy more of our fixed input, our capital. That's a long run situation. They get into the long run, they're able to do it. As soon as they do, they're once again in a new short run situation. So having spent more money, in this case, it's $216, that gets them into a new short run situation that has a new average total cost curve. Because they've spent more on their fixed input, then the spreading effect of the fixed input is going to be dominant beyond the point of the minimum cost of that first average total cost curve. So, so again, you're going to get the curve decreasing over a range where, like that initial curve, again representing a lower fixed cost that's being spread out, where that one starts to increase, you'll see that the new one is going to be decreasing beyond that, because again, there's more fixed costs to be spread out, more of that spreading effect to be pulling down the average cost of producing. So at low quantities, low fixed costs will yield low average total cost. So if the firm wanted to be small, then it wouldn't make sense for it to purchase more capital, to purchase more of this food preparation equipment, because on average it costs them less to produce if they want to be small. So if they're going to produce 1 to 4 units, let's say, then for them it makes sense not to have spent that extra amount. But obviously for Selena, she's doing well. She wants to sell more, so she does. If she were to get bigger, then she would be moving along this average total cost curve with that same amount of capital, and her average cost of producing would go up. She realizes that that is a problem for her, and so she winds up spending more money and getting on this new average total cost curve, at which case you can see that those additional units of salsa that she wants to produce on average cost her less to produce, because again, she spent more money on her fixed costs, and therefore the spreading effect of that becomes dominant over a longer range, lowering her average cost of production. So in general, for each output level, there is some choice of fixed cost that's going to minimize the firm's average total cost for that output level. Once the firm gets past their minimum cost output, then that is the point where their average cost will start to increase, and that is the point where they need to start thinking about investing more money in their capital in order to lower their average cost of producing. Because again, if you think about just like 1 unit of something being sold, then they're gonna get the price for that. The difference between the price and what it costs them on average to produce will be their profit. And so that is why the average cost of production is so important. That's how they figure out their profits. But as you can see, average cost will change, and it all depends on how much the fixed input is, and how dominant the spreading effect is, and that will dictate over what range the firm should be operating in order to maximize their profits. So for most firms, it's realistic to assume that there's many possible choices of fixed costs, not just 2. Given sufficient time, firms will want to adjust fixed costs to a new level that minimize the average total cost for new output levels. Suppose we do a thought experiment and calculate the lowest possible average total cost that could be achieved for each output level if the firm were to choose its fixed cost for each output level. Yeah. Yes. That's the only way, because the short run is defined by the fact that there's a fixed input and therefore you have a fixed cost. The only way to change that is to be in the long run where everything is variable and you can then buy more of that other thing that you couldn't buy more of before. But once you do, you're locked into that and you're locked into a new short run situation. All right, so suppose we do a thought experiment and calculate the lowest possible average total cost that can be achieved for each output level. if the firm were to choose its fixed cost for each output level. So suppose we were in sort of this magical place where the firm can always just, at their whim, change the amount of their fixed input. Economists have given this thought experiment a name. It's called the long-run average total cost curve. So the long-run average total cost curve is the relation between output and average total cost when fixed cost has been chosen to minimize the average total cost for each level of output. In the long run, when a producer has had time to choose the fixed cost appropriate for the desired level of output, the producer will be at some point on the long-run average total cost curve. If the output level is altered, so they commit to a certain level of capital that will minimize their cost of production, but if they decide once they're there to produce more, they will instead be moving along their current short-run average total cost curve. So it won't be on its long-run average total cost curve again until once again it readjusts its fixed cost for the new output level. So let's say they've purchased a certain amount of capital and they are on this average total cost curve. This is the minimum cost output level for them. So the curve AT3 shows short-run average total cost if Selena has chosen the level of fixed cost that minimizes her average total cost at an output of 3 cases of salsa per day. So she's producing 3 cases of salsa per day, and she's chosen the amount of capital she needs to be able to minimize the cost of producing that. So again, this is confirmed by the fact that at 3 cases per day, that touches the long-run average total cost curve. Similarly, let's say that she had purchased more capital and she was actually on this average total cost curve, average total cost 6. That one shows a short-run average total cost if Selena had chosen the level of fixed cost that minimizes the average total cost of producing 6 cases per day. Suppose Selena initially chose to be on average total cost 6, so she thought, okay, I'm going to produce 6 cases per day. If she produces 6 cases per day, her firm will be on point C on both its short-run and the long-run average total cost curve. Suppose, however, that Selena ends up producing only 3 cases of salsa per day, having already spent the money to minimize the cost of producing 6. So that means that she would be on this average total cost curve and would be moving back, which means that she would be increasing her average cost of producing. That would be wasting money, right? So she would be, in the short run, her average total cost will be indicated by point B, and that is no longer on the long run average total cost curve. Well, so this is not really one that she can be on exactly. This is like the path that she could take overall by changing her capital over time at different levels. But yeah, she's on AT6, AT3 would be better for her, right? So if Selena had known that she would be producing only 3 cases per day, she would have been better off choosing a lower level of fixed cost, the one associated with AT3, and thereby achieving a lower average total cost of producing. She could do this, for example, by selling her production plant and like purchasing a smaller one. So basically getting rid of some capital and therefore getting onto that new average total cost curve that would minimize the cost of producing 3 cases of salsa. Then the firm would find itself on point A, and therefore she would be on her long-run total cost curve, which lies below point B. Suppose conversely that Selena ends up producing 9 cases per day. So let's say that she was on AT6 and she chose to produce 9 cases per day. So she purchased a certain amount of capital to minimize producing 6 cases per day, but she decided, I'm going to produce more than that because I'm doing really well. In order to do that, she had to move along her average total cost curve 6, which means that her average cost of producing 9 cases went up quite a bit. But she would be better off purchasing more equipment and incurring a higher fixed cost in order to reduce her variable cost and move her to ATC 9. So if she, at that point, were to purchase more in the long run, purchase more capital, she'd be on ATC 9 and therefore be able to minimize the cost of producing 9 cases, which would put her back on the long run average total cost curve. So the distinction between the short run and the long run total cost curve is extremely important in making sense of how real firms operate over time. A company that has to increase output suddenly to meet a surge in demand will typically find that in the short run, its average total cost will go up sharply because it's hard to get extra production out of existing facilities. But given time to build a new factory or machinery, short run average total cost will fall. So now what does it mean to be along this range of the long run average total cost curve, the bottom of it, and then this range over here? Well, we describe those as returns to scale. So what determines the shape of the long run average total cost curve? The answer is that scale, the size of a firm's operation, is often an important determinant of a long run average total cost of production. Firms that experience scale effects in production find that their long run average total cost changes substantially depending on the quantity of output they produce. So over this range here, where the long run average total cost is decreasing, we say that there are increasing returns to scale, also known as economies of scale. And that is, again, when long run average total costs decline as output increases. Salinas Gourmet Salsas experience increasing returns to scale of output over ranges from, in this case, 0 up until about 5. In contrast, there are decreasing returns to scale, also known as diseconomies of scale, when the long-run average total cost of producing increases. There's also a third possible relation between long-run average total cost and scale, and that is constant returns to scale, when long-run average total cost is constant as output increases. In this case, the firm's long-run average total cost curve is horizontal over the output for which there are constant returns to scale. Salinas Gourmet Salsas have constant returns to scale when it produces anywhere from 5 to 7. All right, so what are these returns to scale? How do they arise? Well, increasing returns often arise from the increased specialization that larger output levels require. So as the firm decides to produce more and more, they wind up hiring more and more people, and the more people the firm has, the more each individual person can specialize in a very specific task, right? Like, people don't have to be doing a variety of things. They could just focus on like one thing, right? Just making sure that one bolt is always like weighted the right way that's needed to create like the car engine. Like, there's enough people that can really be so specific about their task that it makes the production process really efficient, which means that the average cost of producing will be going down. There will be increasing returns to scale. There will be economies of scale. So a larger scale of operation means that individual workers can limit themselves to more specialized tasks, becoming more skilled and efficient at doing them. Another source of increasing returns is very large initial setup costs. Very large initial setup costs means a lot of fixed costs. If you have a hell of a lot of fixed costs being invested in a production process, then that means that the spreading effect is going to be dominant over a very long range. And so a firm will get bigger and probably pretty big, and they will be decreasing their average cost of producing in the long run because they had to set up a huge amount of facilities to be able to supply what they're supplying. This usually happens with like utility companies, like maybe that just sprout up and they have to not only set up like their operations to be able to produce whatever it is they're producing, but also they need distribution networks of piping and wires and things that cost a lot of money to really set up to be able to supply and distribute what they're going to sell. And so those large fixed costs that you need just to be able to operate in those industries will again create a very dominant spreading effect over a long range of output, which allows them to decrease the average cost of producing and get really big. A third source of increasing returns found in certain high-tech industries such as software development is that the value of a good or service to an individual increases when a large number of others own or use the same good or service. So like Microsoft Windows, the more people used it, the more people valued it. It became cheaper for them to produce it, but because more people were using it, then it made sense for them to produce more. And so the average cost of producing went down for them. They had increasing returns to scale due to what are called network effects. Decreasing returns, the opposite scenario, typically arise when firms get too big because they just get too big and there's not enough ability for them to coordinate and become efficient. So that decreasing returns to scale in the long run average total cost curve that we saw. And then finally, constant returns to scale. In those cases, there's no effect on the firm's long run average total cost. The firm can get big or small. It doesn't matter. There's a range over which getting bigger or smaller will have no effect on average cost of production. Question? All right, folks, we are done for the day. Good job. Are we done for the day? Is it, oh, it's 1:35. Okay, so we have a little bit more time, but well, let's call it a day. I thought it was 1:45 for some reason. Anyway, yeah, so we're done with this chapter, so we'll have one more chapter to go. I'll open up the homework for this. I'll also open up the homework for the other one, just so it's already open and you can do whenever you want to do it. If you want to get ahead, you can. Either way, have a great weekend. I'll see you on Tuesday.